and your job is to listen. Now, as my father was always fond of saying, if you finish your job before I finish my job, you have my permission to take a nap. Here we go. Let's start by doing some interesting things about Kennedy and Lincoln, and this is where it gets really edgy for me, that I'll say the right name. People, even from the day of the assassination, if you remember that day, started comparing Lincoln and Kennedy. And as they went through the different things, more and more things have been revealed. And this book mentions a lot of them, but there are many more than just this. So let's get started and we'll see where it takes us. Abraham Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846. John Kennedy was elected to Congress in 1946. Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860. John Kennedy was elected president in 1960. The names Lincoln and Kennedy each contain 7 letters. Both men were particularly concerned with civil rights. Both presidents had one of their children die while they were serving as president. Lincoln's son Willie, died, and Kennedy's son Patrick died shortly after his birth. Both presidents were shot on a Friday. Both presidents were shot in the head. Lincoln's secretary was named Kennedy. Kennedy's secretary, as most of you know, was named Mrs. Lincoln. And both of those, Mrs. Kennedy for Lincoln and Mrs. Lincoln for Kennedy, warned them not to go to the Ford Theater or to Dallas, and of course they did. I want to say just a word about the authors. I think you all know Bill O'Reilly. He's on Fox television, and he's very opinionated. That's surprising, isn't it? And he's written a lot of books, but he is the anchorman for O'Reilly Factor. And he worked with the same author, Martin Duggar, as the co-writer of Killing Lincoln. They're now working and almost finished. It could be finished, I don't know, but they're doing Killing Jesus. And I think that's probably going to be more popular than Killing Lincoln or Killing Kennedy, but watch for that. Martin Duggar is a historian, and he just lives and breathes history. His most famous book would be The Epic Adventures of Stanley and Livingston, and it's a good one. I would encourage you to read that too. Bill O'Reilly taught history in the public school before he became so-called famous. They wanted to make history accessible to everybody, and they wanted to tell their story exactly how it happened, what the things were that were surrounding the tragedy in this case, and they wanted their reader to be both informed and entertained, and that's what they did. It seems to me that every generation has some catastrophic thing happen, and when that happens, they remember from then on where they were, what they were doing at that particular time. And I think for my parents, it was Pearl Harbor. A lot of things happened in the Depression and so forth, but they could always tell you exactly where they were when Pearl Harbor came around, and also when the president died, Roosevelt died. My children's generation, the big thing that they remember, and they were older, of course, when this happened, was 9/11. But there have been other things that they remember too. For me, it was the assassination of President Kennedy, and the assassination of Martin Luther King, and the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. All took place within 5 years of each other. So those are things I remember, and if we have enough time in a little while, I'd like to hear some of the things that you think were catastrophic or very important in your life you've never forgotten. The way that I heard about Kennedy was I was teaching school at Marladen Elementary School in Manhattan, Kansas. And we had lunch hours in those days. We had different days. You could either eat lunch at school or you could go home, and lunch really was an hour. And so I ate at school, but one of my students always went home, and he came back well before 1 o'clock, and he was so out of breath, and he said, "The president's been shot, the president's been shot." And I didn't believe it. I thought, And so, because we had recently had, the day before, a lesson where I was telling them, don't believe everything you read, don't believe everything you hear, You had to check it up yourself. So there was this little kid, telling me the president was shot, and I went, oh yeah. Then it came over the intercom that indeed the president had been riding in a motorcade and was going to make a speech at the plaza, and he was going to try and get votes from Texas so he could win a second term. So that's where I was. Well, most of you that were born after or before 1950 should know where you were at what time. Some younger ones than that could know as well. Anyway, as we talk about this tragic event on November 22nd, 1963, we need to know a little of the background. You know so much about Kennedy and you know so much about Oswald, so that they had to really, the two authors had to really dig a little deeper and see if they could find something that you didn't know. You did know, I'm sure, that John Kennedy was handsome. He was very intelligent. He was a charismatic man who came from a very powerful and rich family. You probably know about his father, Joseph Sr. He was a very wealthy man, made his money during Prohibition and bootlegging, and he had some very wise stocks. And so when the stock market crashed in 1929, he was barely affected. And he did a lot of stocks, or a lot of speculation after that. It just got richer and richer. And he wasn't afraid to use his power or his influence to shape the destinies of his children, particularly his sons. So when his sons were born, they had a job. Now most of us, when we had our children, we didn't have them coming out of the womb thinking, here's what you're going to do for the next 21 years, but he did. And Joseph Kennedy Jr., his eldest son, was supposed to be President of the United States. And he grew up thinking about it. And his father directed everything he did. And his father made sure he was in the best schools and he had the best grades. And he also told him to enlist in World War II, and he chose Air Force. And as most of you know, I'm sure, he died in a plane crash. Well, who's the next in line? John Kennedy. And John Kennedy had thought he was out of the loop. He thought, this is good. Joe's going to be the president. That'd be fine with me, and I can do what I want in literature, because he liked to write, as we well know, and teach and be a lawyer. So he was really just a rich playboy at that time. He wasn't married or anything else, and his father told him when he got back from war, when John Kennedy came back, he said, well, your job is, you're going to be president of the United States. And he said, well, I'm not qualified, and I have very little interest in politics, and frankly, what I would really like to do is be a lawyer or do something with literature. And his father said, excuse me, you are going to be the President of the United States. And one of the first things you need to do is get married. So Kennedy was a playboy. And he was like, I've got all this money and all this time. I don't get married. So he began looking around, but his father was looking around for him as well. And his father came across a woman that was in big society, powerful woman, named Jacqueline Kennedy, or not Kennedy. Anyway, he began to court her, but he did it very slowly. And his father was a bit outraged. We got to get married to the right girl at the right time. And so his father also said, you don't have to stick with that woman. You just have to marry somebody to get you elected, and then you go on and have all the affairs you want to have. I'm sure I have all the time myself. And his longtime mistress, the father's longtime mistress, of course, was Gloria Swanson. And she had a lot of influence in California, but many say he really did love her. Anyway, his wife knew all about it, Rose knew all about it, and she just decided to turn a blind eye to it. And that's what all the people that married the Kennedy boys did. They just let them go ahead and philander, and they pretended they didn't know, which worked for them fine, I guess. Anyway, we know that Joseph Sr. did use his power and influence to shape the destinies of all of his boys. His girls he wasn't so concerned with, but he was concerned with their marriages. Well, most of you know, like I said, everything I have told you. I think you know that Kennedy was the youngest elected president, and he was 46 years old, or 43 years old when he took office. No, 46, I'm sorry. But he wasn't the youngest president. You know who the youngest president was? No, Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, though he was not elected, he was thrown into the office by the assassination of his president. So he was 43. So when you're on Jeopardy, and I know you will, and the question comes up, who is the youngest president, you'll have to ask Alex to qualify that. Because the youngest elected was John Kennedy, but the youngest vice president was Teddy Roosevelt. Anyway, I'd like to talk a little bit about Lee Harvey Oswald, and that's one of the things I found extremely interesting in the book, because we've heard so much about John Kennedy constantly. Every year they're digging up something new, and we hear that. And but Lee Harvey Oswald, he was talked about during the time of the assassination, but there were a lot of things I didn't know about him that you might not know either. He was a disturbing person all his life. That's a given, right? Even if you look at his photographs, what's the first photograph that comes in your mind of Lee Harvey Oswald? I would bet it's in that tunnel down where he was shot. And that's not an attractive picture of a man. He'd been beaten, of course, and so his face was bruised and swollen. But he was somewhat handsome, certainly not on John Kennedy's level. But he was somewhat handsome. He was, he had defected to Russia when he was 18 years old. He dropped out of high school as well. And when he went to Russia, his whole thought was, nobody appreciates me in the United States. And he was a communist at heart. And he thought, if I go over to Russia, they're going to be so thrilled with me because I'm so smart. And they're going to say, this, you know, we have great plans for this man. His real hope was that they would hire him to be a spy in the United States. He just didn't think about deflecting to Russia, then coming back and being an American citizen, which he did, and then spying for Russia. You'd think he'd know that he was going to be targeted. But anyway, he didn't seem to know that, so disturbing. It really does tell you a lot about him. He ended up with a menial job in a factory, and he married Maria, who was a Russian girl. She didn't speak much English, just what he taught her. I learned that, and this was the first time I ever heard this, he was a very abusive husband. And she would run away from him and go to friends and try not to have him throw her around. She was immediately not in love with him when they got to the United States, and he got worse and worse and worse. And at the time of the assassination, they had split up for the umpteenth time, and she was living with a friend, and she had 2 children by then with him. Well, he had hoped when he was in Russia to attend Moscow University. And he just knew that the Russians were going to say, come, go to school, we want to have you, you're the best Russian ever. And he hadn't even graduated from high school. And so they didn't even put that on their radar. They just said, you're going to travel to Minsk, and that's where you're going to live, and that's where you're going to work, and you will not travel outside of that. Well, he was a wanderlust, and he couldn't understand what he was doing in this menial job, and he hated it. So he decided, I know what, I'm fed up with life in a communist country, and I'm going to go back to the United States. But I'll always be a communist at heart, don't worry. When he came back and took over as an American citizen again, the FBI, the CIA, the Secret Service, everybody looked at him and had a chart on him and had files on him just to watch him to make sure he wasn't going to come back and do anything. In fact, when they learned that President Kennedy was coming to Dallas, they really looked into his background, and all of the agencies in Texas and in Washington, D.C. decided he was no threat. That's another thing I thought. I can see some threats myself, and I'm not in the CIA. Anyway, he had lived for a long time in the South. His dad died before he was born, and his mother didn't have much money, but she loved to travel around. That's where he died. He went to 22 different addresses to live for a while with his mom, and he went to 12 different schools before he dropped out. He also went to a reform institution, and they had a court-appointed psychiatrist who did an evaluation on him and found him to be, get this, and I'm quoting, withdrawn and socially maladjusted. I could have told him that at no cost. Anyway, he was diagnosed as having a vivid fantasy life so that he could be important, and he was going to be somebody, so he made up things about himself to overcome his shortcomings. Lee Harvey Oswald had absolutely nothing against John Fitzgerald Kennedy. He didn't even know the guy. The book says that they had a whole bunch of wealthy, handsome men in a lineup Oswald could not have picked out Kennedy. He didn't know anything about his policies, but his idea was, when he read in the paper that this motorcade was coming and would carry Kennedy to a speaking engagement, he decided, I've got a job, and I know what it is, because someone who's higher up has spoken to me. And I think he heard voices too. Anyway, he decided his job was to kill John F. Kennedy. The Soviets would be so proud they would beg for him to come home. He just knew that, and he knew that the Americans would be so glad that he finally opened their eyes to who was the really important person in the world. His wife, who beat up so badly she had run away with the 2 children and staying somewhere else, and he had nothing to lose. And so he began planning on how he was going to kill President Kennedy. He was a crack shot in the Marines, and he thought, that's how I'm going to do it. And as he looked in the paper, and you know, in those days they put the route of the president down. They don't do that anymore. But they say he's going to go from the airport to wherever. But this was the direct route. He knew every street he was going to be on. And he was thrilled when he saw that he was going to go by the book depository, because that's where he could be. So a few days before the assassination, he goes up, which I'm sure you've all heard this, he goes up on his lunch hour to about, I don't know, the 5th floor or so of the book depository in Dallas. And he set up a bench, he set up a rifle, he had everything in place, because nobody went up there. And nobody ever had lunch with him or anything else, so he had a wide open place. And so he went up there and got everything ready, and we know what happened. Anyway, as you look at Kennedy and you look at Oswald, they're 2 exact opposites of one another from the get-go. Interestingly enough, John Kennedy knew nothing about Oswald, and Oswald knew nothing about Kennedy. But Kennedy would have had Oswald killed if he thought his life was in danger. That's a given. And Oswald had in mind that he was going to kill the president. So the book begins to take a behind-the-scenes look, and it begins to look at the different people and the different theories of who killed him. Did Oswald kill him by himself? I think most of you know that Robert Kennedy, at the very beginning, just shortly after the assassination, said it wasn't a one-man job. And he got crucified in the press for that, because the Warren Commission was trying, obviously, to get the report out, and they started out with the idea that it was a one-man job, and then worked backwards. And so Bobby Kennedy said that, well, just this past December, do you remember the hoopla in the press about Bobby Kennedy's papers had been found, and he says in those papers that Oswald wasn't the lone killer. And I thought, I saw that the day after the assassination, but they're acting like it's brand new. It probably is to the reporters who were 11. But anyway, I thought, well, okay, so I looked too for personalities as I went through the book to see why other theories were around. They bring to life the Secret Service people who took care of Kennedy, and they talk about the Secret Service not just by themselves, but the FBI agents and other high-level politicians and their entourages. They find in this report, this is back in the 60s, of course, they discover that Kennedy was hated by a lot of people in the United States. And there are a lot of theories out there that LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, had something to do with the ordering the killing of Kennedy. And why would you think that? Because he hated LBJ. LBJ hated him. And it's amazing to me that Kennedy was able to use all of his power and do what he wanted to do. And what he did was, he said, I don't want that man in the cabinet meetings. I don't want that man in any kind of meetings I'm having with foreign dignitaries. I don't want him in there. And of course Lyndon Johnson knew they were having a cabinet meeting, and the first time he went in and he was told there's no chair for you. And so he left. And then he got rather angry shortly before the assassination, and he went in the room. And Kennedy said again to him, there's no chair for you in here. And he said, that's okay, I'll stand. So he stood in the back, and every now and then he tried to interject something in the meeting. He was Vice President of the United States. And Kennedy would say, silence. And he never let him speak in those. So LBJ did not like John Kennedy. John Kennedy did not like LBJ. But the reason John Kennedy didn't like LBJ is because his brother, who was the Attorney General, Bobby hated Lyndon Johnson. And so that fueled the fire more. And it's interesting how he had to be Attorney General until his term was up. And then then LBJ could appoint whoever he wanted to. Then you start thinking about Joseph Sr. again and all the money he poured into the campaign. And it's often been said that he bought the votes. That could very well be because he had plenty of money and lots of influence. So then you get into if Kennedy or if LBJ had nothing to do with it, if Oswald was the lone killer, well, let's see. How about looking into the mafia? And that was probably the biggest thing they looked into. And Joseph Sr. had many, many connections with the mob. And that is well documented. So people have now started saying, you know, Sam Giancana in particular would do anything that Joseph Kennedy Sr. told him to do. And he had a lot of mafia connections, and so maybe the mafia killed him. Well, why would the mafia kill him? Because Bobby had gone after them as Attorney General on day one, saying, I'm going to get rid of organized crime. And John Kennedy got on the bandwagon a little late for that, but then he began to bleed his brother, and so he wanted to cut all ties. Well, one of the ties he had to cut was Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack. And Frank Sinatra built this beautiful mansion in California, and the president was going to be there. And so Frank Sinatra had said, I invite you to come. None of us will be there, but I invite you to come use our house, and you'll have all the amenities you need. And I'll even build, Frank said, a helipad for a helicopter. And Kennedy said, fine. Or Kennedy's entourage said, fine. When it got closer, Bobby Kennedy said, you can't go there. You can't stay in Frank Sinatra's house. He's got connections to the mob and is being investigated. You can't do that. And so Kennedy did something. He told his staff that he was needing to talk to Bing Crosby, who was a staunch Democrat, and had, at least no one thought he had any connections to the mob. And so they called Bing Crosby and said, could we use your mansion? And Bing Crosby said, sure. There was just one little problem. They never told Frank Sinatra they were coming. And so when Frank Sinatra realized they got in town, and he had gone out to meet them, even though he knew they were going to take a helicopter to his place, he was just so overzealous in friendship with the president, and he didn't even make it to the airport before somebody called him and said, exactly how to get to Bing Crosby's house. And that's how he found out they weren't coming. So the story is that he went out with a hammer and a jackhammer and got rid of his helipad. And he decided that from that time on, he, Frank Sinatra, and the Rat Pack were going to do everything they could for the opposition, which was the Republicans. So it didn't hurt Kennedy very much, and I don't even know if he knew about it, because he didn't really care. Anyway, the word Camelot, it's interesting in the book, came up because after the assassination, it was actually Jackie Kennedy who said to the press that Camelot is dead. And the press picked that up, and they called it the end of Camelot, and that's all we've ever heard, right? Camelot, Camelot, Camelot. And she only mentioned that because that was Kennedy's favorite musical. And she said that's what it was like Camelot on that basis. What Jacqueline Kennedy did not say at that time to a reporter, and nobody told the reporters, John F. Kennedy had a roving eye. That'd probably be the easiest way of saying it. He was a world-class womanizer. He used to swim in his pool in the White House every day at noon, from noon to 12:30 or noon to 1, and he swam nude. And he insisted, the Secret Service insisted that they had to be in there with him. He couldn't swim alone. Well, he wasn't a modest man. He said, sure. And then he decided all these women he was bringing into the White House to have fun and games with him, he decided they should swim with him. So if you were going to be coming to him for a little dalliance in the afternoon, you were going to be swimming nude in this pool with all of the Secret Service watching you. Okay, they'd do anything for Kennedy. His wife knew about it, but she had a very clever way of dealing with it on some occasions. Usually she just stayed in her room, and he took his paramours into his room, and they tiptoed down the hall, as the book says, so that they wouldn't distract her. or disturb her. Anyway, she had turned, like I said, a blind eye to this, and she didn't want the press to know at all. So she talked to John Kennedy's very, very good friend, Walter Cronkite. Remember him? Walter Cronkite was probably at the pinnacle of the best anchor on CBS. Everybody somehow or other, they sure did. And I remember when he would speak, my parents would, I mean, they knew this guy's telling the truth. Well, whenever he was in Washington, D.C., John Kennedy demanded through Jackie that he be there at the pool. And everything he saw there with his women and all this kind of stuff, he was to keep out of the press. So it was Walter Cronkite who made sure nobody at CBS ever talked about it. And it was Walter Cronkite who made sure that the Secret Service didn't. One thing Walter Cronkite had a lot of difficulty was when he was sleeping with these other women, Kennedy was, he was thinking, that looks like a breach of national security. You might say something in their ear, during that time. And so they worried about him. And Walter did everything he could to avert attention. And Kennedy told him one day, I have to be with a woman every single day or I get migraine headaches. And Walter did go to Jackie, and he told her that, and she kind of rolled her eyes, they said, and that was okay. She wasn't going to deal with that. Anyway, it was never reported, and so we, at least when I was growing up, I knew nothing about his dalliances. Nothing at all. When I began to hear later, I thought, how did the press miss that? I mean, here, when you think about it, the lowest person on the totem pole does something, but he's a politician or he works for the government, and we can't wait to have week after week after week of this guy's rendezvous with people. But anyway, nobody talked about it then. The book does discuss Marilyn Monroe, and I know you all know that he had an affair with Marilyn Monroe. It can't be proven, and all the people that are the people in those stories are dead. But Marilyn Monroe, the way the rumors go, is that she had an affair with John Kennedy, and then John Kennedy dumped her, as he did most women he was with. And so she went on and had an affair with his brother, Bobby. And that can't be proven, but the rumors were that she had Bobby for the sole reason of getting back in the good graces of John Kennedy. Didn't work. You know she died, and you know that she supposedly committed suicide. And Bobby Kennedy's papers say, I don't think she committed suicide, I think she was murdered. But he doesn't say any more than that in those papers. They'll probably find him out. The Kennedys had a wonderful way of saying, you can release this information after 50 years. And it's been 50 years since the assassination, but it hasn't been quite 50 years for Bobby Kennedy. So we may find out a whole lot of other things. You all remember her singing Happy Birthday, Mr. President, coming late to the event and having that throaty, sexy voice. And he was mortified, John Kennedy was. His wife was sitting there with him. And if anybody, even a casual bystander, could tell there was something up between those two. And so Jack Kennedy at that particular moment said, she's never to come back to the White House again, she's out. And that wasn't exactly what she wanted. Anyway, it looks at all of these things, and one little thing, of course, I knew nothing about, was that there was this reporter. And this reporter in 1997 was a young reporter, and he was on his way to Palm Beach, Florida, because he had heard that there was a man there who knew Lee Harvey Oswald way back when and had a theory of his own about what happened. And he was anxious to talk to the press, but nobody had come by to ask him. But this young reporter did, and so he flew to Palm Beach, Florida, and when he got to the man's house, he knocked on the door, and then he heard a shotgun blast from the house. The man had committed suicide, and the reporter is Bill O'Reilly. It talks about how Joseph Sr., he figures in so much of all of this story, went to John Kennedy shortly after he had been elected president and said, I know who your attorney general is going to be. It's going to be Bobby. And John said, I don't think he's the best one for the job. I had so-and-so in mind. And his father said, excuse me, the attorney general will be Bobby. Bobby, when he approached him, the father said, your new job is attorney general, and you will soon be appointed. And Bobby said to him, and this obviously is all documented. Actually, you'll never guess by whom, but J. Edgar Hoover. So you have to take it at face value. J. Edgar Hoover despised him. Anyway, he said, I don't think I'm the man for the job. And his father said, yes, you are. And shortly thereafter, he was appointed Attorney General, and it turned out to be the best thing for Kennedy ever. And it turned out to be the best thing for Robert Kennedy. Of course, when John F. Kennedy died, Lyndon Johnson was trying to get him immediately out. But there's protocol, and he had to wait until he had done his year term. There are lots and lots of conspiracy theories. I remember the one about Jim Garrison, and I think you probably do too, in New Orleans, the DA, and he did a very thorough investigation of the assassination, and he came up with some ideas of who killed Kennedy, and he did that movie, JFK, I think it was called, that was based on his book. So anyway, he had his theory. Garrison is not even mentioned in the book, not a word about him. And I thought that was odd, because that was a big theory during that time, but he wasn't even mentioned. And very, very little is actually mentioned about the Mafia, because the authors, not these guys, but the authors of other books that they were writing were a little afraid that the Mafia was going to come down on them, so they soft pedaled it. Another interesting thing was the details of what happened in Dallas once he was dead. This part I didn't know all the details on. I thought it was fascinating. After Kennedy died, Jacqueline Kennedy wanted some time alone with him, so they put him in a little room. It was a small room right there in the hospital, in Parkland Hospital. And she had her time with John Kennedy, and then the Secret Service men came in and they said, we have to get him out of here fast. We got a problem. The problem was that the Dallas, Texas authorities, FBI, all of their people in Dallas said he died in Dallas, we have to do the autopsy in Dallas, his body belongs to Dallas, this is it. And the Secret Service said no. And so they argued back and forth like face to face. And Jacqueline Kennedy was being pushed back further and further as more people came into the room. And she was actually, they say, crushed up against the wall with this bed or this gurney pushed up against her, and she couldn't say anything. They argued and they argued and they argued, and then the Secret Service had some tactic to get the Dallas police force and the Dallas FBI men to leave the room for just a second. And they don't really tell you what that is, but it was something about you have to get a court order or whatever to take his body. The minute those people left, the Secret Service rushed him with the cart out, and Jacqueline Kennedy was way back in the back because nobody had thought to take her on and take her out. And so she was running behind that, trying to get her husband secure away from the Dallas people. We don't know what the Dallas autopsy would have revealed, but we do know when he got back to Washington, D.C., his body did, that they did an autopsy, then they did a second autopsy, and then they did a third autopsy. And people have asked, what changed? And some people say there was a lot of things going on that changed by the authorities who wanted the results to come out that it was a single killer. There's so many rumors about the Mafia having a hand in his death, and some of the things they go into is the fact that Joseph Sr. paid the Mafia to vote for and to see that all of their friends voted for John Kennedy as well. The interesting thing to me is I remember hearing about the CIA. There was a lot of people thinking the CIA had a hand in it, and I thought, why? This doesn't make sense to me. But in this book, they go into great detail about Allen Dulles, not John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State to another president, but Allen Dulles was the head of the CIA at that time. During the Bay of Pigs, which you know was a horrendous thing, and this book goes into more details than you'll ever want to know about that, but it is a scary story. Anyway, Dulles was the head of the CIA, and he was feeding Kennedy and his entourage facts about what was going on with Fidel Castro, though everybody knew he wanted Kennedy dead. And Nikita Khrushchev, he wanted Kennedy dead immediately. And so Allen Dulles got caught in the middle. And when the Bay of Pigs was averted by the hair and the chin, Dulles was fired. And Dulles was furious at Kennedy because he thought he had done everything he should do, and he'd given him all the information he had. But Dulles was mad, and so Dulles got, according to this book, the theory is that Dulles got some of his ex-CIA members together and said, we're going to take this guy out. And so that's how the CIA gets involved, and that's so sad to me because that's an American and once head of the CIA. So you not only had Dulles angry at him and could have been part of a plot, you had Nikita Khrushchev who wanted him dead, you had Cuban dictator Fidel Castro that wanted him dead, and all of these things are swirling around on what exactly happened. And the only thing that Kennedy did wrong, really, was he went to Texas because LBJ said, this is the only way you can get Texas votes. You've got to go. And so a man that hated Kennedy sent him to Dallas where he knew he could be, that's another theory. Anyway, the book does not clear this up for us. It doesn't give you any ending point at all. I doubt we'll ever know every detail about this, but it's fascinating. There were some things I was very disappointed in the book. They didn't even try to give us a closing. They just didn't do it at all. But I promised you I'd give you a few more links between Lincoln and Kennedy, so here goes. I bet you know most of them, but maybe there's one you didn't. Both men were assassinated by Southerners. Both were succeeded by Southerners. Both successors were named Johnson. I thought I should remember that. Andrew Johnson succeeded Lincoln in 1808. In 1908, Lyndon Johnson succeeded Kennedy. Both assassins were known by their three names, John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald. Both assassins' names have 15 letters in them. I don't know why we need to know that, but both presidents were assassinated in the presence of their wives. Booth ran from a theater, Booth ran from a theater and was caught in a warehouse. Remember, a tobacco warehouse. And Oswald ran from a warehouse and was captured in a theater. Booth and Oswald were both assassinated before they went to trial. People thought, that was the other theory about Jack Ruby. And Jack Ruby had great ties to the mafia because he owned nightclubs and they would provide strippers and other things that he couldn't get on his own, and the mafia was part of that. So again, people say, see, Jack Ruby had no business in the tunnel that morning. It was a Sunday after the assassination on Friday, and they were going to take him through an underground tunnel. They were going to take Oswald, heavily guarded, and then he was going to go to a safer place. Didn't work out so well for him, did it? Anyway, he went down the tunnel, and Jack Ruby was among all the reporters that were down there. Jack Ruby had ingratiated himself with the reporters and the police, and if he wasn't a reporter, he wasn't going to do anything with it. He was just a friend. He had no business in there. And of course, we know that as they let him down, Ruby just comes out in the crowd and shoots him and kills him on contact. Ruby always maintained that he just did it because he was a patriot, and others have said, no, he did it because he was ordered to kill him, so that Oswald wouldn't go to trial. And it's interesting to me, there's no question that John Wilkes Booth killed Kennedy. He bragged about it all the time, and certainly Oswald did too, but people saw him and people worked with him. But we'll never know from Oswald, and I know each person that I was with during that period of time when we watched it on television, so just every minute of it, it just seemed odd that Oswald was killed. If he only could have gone to trial, but he couldn't. So anyway, two other things about Mrs. Kennedy and Mrs. Lincoln that are the same. Mrs. Lincoln, as you know, loved good clothes, and she spent more money than Abraham Lincoln ever could have earned, in the office or out of the office, and he used to chastise her for that over and over again. And Mrs. Kennedy loved clothes, and we all know that John Kennedy would chastise her and say, I don't have the money, you got to put this. And he, of course, donated his entire salary, which was $200,000 a year at the time, to charity, and he lived off Kennedy's own means. And so those two things are alike about the wives. And then there's another thing that's interesting to me, and that is that both of those women went to Congress and asked for money to redo the White House. And then a little story, a little backstory, and there's so many in this book. that's interesting is, I don't know if you remember, but I remember watching Jackie Kennedy give us a tour of the White House on television when it was through, and you're just sitting there, this beautiful woman breathlessly telling about the White House. And it was live, remember? It was really thrilling. It wasn't live at all. I thought, what? So I kept reading. It turns out that Jackie Kennedy was a chain smoker. We didn't know that, and it would have been frowned upon had we known it. So she would talk about the White House for a certain period of time, and then she would go in another little room and have a whole bunch, she was a chain smoker, she had a whole bunch of cigarettes, they'd redo her hair and makeup, she'd go out and have this live performance again, so we had no idea she was going in for her nasty little habit. Well, I promised you I'd quit, and I'll be true to my word, so I am going to. Are there any questions or comments that you care to make? Anybody want to tell us what they were doing when Kennedy was assassinated?
Yeah, I was a junior in high school and I was in biology lab in Arapahoe, Colorado. Remember it distinctly.
Did the teacher tell you, or?
Yes.
Okay, that's interesting.
I was going back to work about it.
On the radio?
Yeah, that would be the radio. And I called my dad. He said, yeah, I just heard about it. We all went to the house and we stayed there for 3 days. And went over to TV to lunch. And I went there, I was in college and I heard it was going around to the student union and nobody believed me.
Yeah.
None of us knew the vice president's name at that point.
Oh!
You know, politics wasn't important.
No.
And we knew Kennedy was the first council president. I didn't remember Johnson's name.
Yeah. Wow. Well, you missed out on that one, didn't you? Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
But did the, I read a book, but they didn't mention that his Oswald's communication with the Cuban embassy.
He constantly did that when he really got this plan in mind that he was going to do the assassination. He decided he would never go back to Mother Russia because they had treated him so badly, but he really liked Cuba. Suddenly he saw a partner there, and I think we can all agree Fidel Castro has some problems, some disturbing problems in his life too, and I think that's where Oswald thought, if I go there, and that's why all of these rumors just swirl everywhere, but I wish that they had given us their thoughts on how this happened, but they left so many interviews out. They never interviewed any of the people that were still alive that were on the grassy knoll, and this business about 2 or 3 shots, and they have the Zapruder video. They didn't have it for the Warren Commission, and if you remember, the Warren Commission was supposed to get things done like that, and they did. And so you have to wonder how much of that was really researched, especially when you think back to the autopsy and the fact that Washington, D.C. wanted to do that autopsy, and they did it 3 times. And I think if they had gotten what they wanted the first time, it would have stopped. But they didn't.
Did the book mention the bullet that went through Governor Connolly?
It does say that they were all, she asked if the book said anything about the bullet that went through Connolly. Governor Connolly and his wife were also in that limousine. And that's one of the theories, is how it could go through Kennedy and to Connolly and so forth. But they don't really, they just touch on those things, assuming everyone who's reading the book knows it. And I think that's a shame, because
He said there were 2 shots.
yes, he's always maintained that, and his wife too. And Jacqueline Kennedy never spoke much about it, but when she did, she would confirm when people kept asking her, and she demurely said, I don't want to talk about that. And that is where you sure have seen pictures, if you weren't around then, of her climbing out the back. And the press continually said that she was trying to get away. And then the others said she was trying to gather the brain material and put it back in her husband. The Secret Service guy who was climbing on the back to help her said that's what she was saying over and over was, I have to put this back. He has to have his brain. He's got a wonderful brain, and I'm going to put it back. She was in shock. She didn't know what she was doing. But she was not trying, I don't believe she was trying to get out of that car. I think she was more concerned with putting Jack back together.
JoAnne,
Yes.
the authors of Dennis said a lot about his moral character.
Yes.
Did they have any comment as to his leadership of his country?
They actually treat him as if he's Saint Kennedy. We can't help but do that. This was such a charismatic man. We had just come out of Eisenhower, who barely even knew this woman who was walking behind him all the time, you know. And she wasn't an attractive woman, I never thought, Mrs. Eisenhower. So, Mimi. So anyway, yeah, I should have been here to talk to Roy Bird about that. But anyway, they just thought of Jacqueline Kennedy as being the most beautiful woman in the world, and they weren't going to do anything. In fact, during that time, the press, I don't know if you remember this or not, but the press, in big cities particularly, would say, it's too bad we don't have a royalty here, because Jackie Kennedy could just take over from John, and it would be perfect. And so a lot of people thought she should have just been, you know, the next person in line. She would have been terrible when you think about it. She's a beautiful woman, but when she married Onassis, the press really hit her hard, because not only was she marrying someone out of the United States, but she also was marrying a man with a tremendous amount of money, and who had already told her, you can buy whatever you want. And that's the kind of man she had to be with, you know. So I can't imagine if she was president of the United States, she'd be very busy having designers come in and do her clothes, so we have less time for the United States. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, but she did a good job of really keeping it all secret and keeping it all, it frustrated a lot of people. And I have to wonder who was the first, and it happened in, 50 years, which is just about this time, after he was assassinated, when she released, or she's dead, but had said that they could release some of his papers. And when they talk about all of these women that he was with, and how much he needed this, and he had to be around it, and all that sort of thing, she did a really good job. And I have to wonder, who was that first journalist who found a little tidbit and began to look around, and then came out with, he was a womanizer? Because none of us at that time knew it at all. We could have pictured it because he was so good looking, but he was so wonderful to his wife. Like I was saying, Mamie was just in the background with her hat on, if you remember. And Jacqueline Kennedy was such an icon. Everybody wore pillbox hats, and everybody wanted their hair done like her. And I think it was just absolutely Camelot in that sense. We were all enamored with her. Well, thank you so much. I'm sorry I was over, but